You're listening to the Tech Society Podcast, the show that gives you a fresh take on our technology-dominated society, with your hosts Alex Dunmo and John Nguyen.
Hey techies, welcome to another episode of Tech Society. Today we interview Rocky Scopelliti. Rocky is a world-renowned futurologist, author, media commentator, and international keynote speaker. His recent book, titled Australia 2030, Where the Bloody Hell Are We?, is a professional sentiment about the decade ahead, based on a major study conducted before and during the eye of the COVID-19 storm. His 16 years of research has concentrated on one single question: how do we increase our capacity to adapt to a world of accelerated change?
We'll just jump right in and just start talking about stuff, basically.
Yeah, I'd love to know. It'll be great for our listeners to know more about the book as well.
Yeah, Youthquake.
Yeah,
4.0.
fantastic.
Yeah,
So there's two. There's Youthquake 4.0, and then there's the one that I've just launched, which is Australia 2030. So I'll refer to both of those because the research was different in both.
I love the subtitle for that one, Where the Bloody Hell Are We?
Well, isn't that a fascinating question? Because when I was going through the research, I kept coming back to, irrespective of who you are, how you're being impacted by COVID, we are all asking that same question. Yep. What's going on? Where the bloody hell are we? And so when we look into our future, that question becomes even more important, I think, because the view that we had about our future was completely thrown out the window over the course of March and April.
Do you feel like that it more exposed the truth rather than changing things?
We've moved things faster too, I imagine.
Yeah. Hey, look, that's a great question, because the way I presented the research in the book Australia 2030 was to look at the differences between the way with which respondents over the course of January and February were different from those of March and April. And it's really fascinating to see things. For example, when it comes to thinking about the next 10 years, what do you think are going to be the biggest issues impacting the world and Australia? Now, climate change emerged as number one. Now, we've got to remember, we just came off the bushfires, right? But then those that responded in March and April, low economic growth shot up to be number one. And so you could see how our views about the future had profoundly changed during that course. What's really fascinating, I think, is that when I looked at the question of, how optimistic or not are you about the level of technological and scientific change over the coming decade, Australians overall were very optimistic, about 2 in 3. Now, that shot up to 90% for those that responded over the course of March and April. And so the interesting point here is how under pressure from COVID, our optimism increased on the role of technology and science. Because I think it really those two areas really brought it to the front of our mindsets. We were looking for scientific answers. We're looking for scientific explanations as to what's going on. We all had to learn about the curve, flatten the curve. What is this curve? But nonetheless, I think, as I was watching that being explained, I thought to myself, this is probably the first time that the mass market has understood the difference between linear development versus exponential development.
Yeah.
And we were watching it daily, weren't we? The curve and where we were, when's it going to flatten? And, and then we were pegged against all other countries, still are. And so in many respects, we felt what exponential change means and how it impacts our whole lives. Sadly, in a healthcare setting, but nonetheless, it brings forward the point that we've been living in exponential change now for quite some time.
Absolutely. And I think it also exposed people to how technology can be used, whereas they weren't thinking about it previously. They were just going to their job and going home. And now suddenly they're doing their job from home and they're realizing just how possible that is, which for tech guys seems pretty
Yeah, but a lot of businesses
normal,
have been working slowly, the slow march towards remote work, and it all happens super fast.
That's right. It's fascinating to have seen 5 years of behavioural change unfold in 5 weeks. And what's fascinating about all of this is that what it taught us was that this is not a technological issue. Organisations were pushing out 30,000 and 20,000 workers out into the suburbs. Our networks have performed extremely well. Yes, there were some, isolated issues here or there, but on the whole, we've performed very, very well. And I think it's interesting that it now sort of brings into question the whole notion of a centralised place of work. What is the future of work in a environment that is uncertain? Well, we're learning that right now, because this is, as we all know, not something that's just going to go away, and nor perhaps is it just going to be an isolated event.
It's an interesting point there. At our place, we made everyone go work from home early March.
February.
Late February.
Yeah.
And I think our original prediction was everyone to return to the office in 3 weeks. A lot of people didn't expect it to last even to today, but
That's right.
no, it's a bit unprecedented for everyone. I think the entire world. So
it is, and in many respects, if you look at our family structures, where you've got dual income parents, all of a sudden we not only had to find separate corners of the house to work, but we had to find a place for the kids and trying to remote school them in between Zoom meetings. So all of these have obviously presented challenges when you look at resiliency and mental health, and I think, and I really feel for the Victorians, because they've had to go into this a second time and for much longer and harder than perhaps what the rest of the nation did.
All these changes that you've mentioned, do you think it's here to stay, or do you think everyone's working towards a vaccine? We're in phase 3 trials right now. Once everyone gets over the hump of this global pandemic, will we go back to the way things were?
So no, there is no normal, and and it's essentially feeds into the question that I've been pursuing for the last 16 years, and that question, which has been the basis of my research, and that question is, how do we increase our capacity to adapt to a world of accelerated change? Now, what's fascinating about that question is that, unlike a puzzle where we know what the answer is, or we know where the end is, this question behaves much more like a mystery, where just when you think you know the answer, something changes. And so the point here is that we are coming out of a very linear way of thinking about our future. So let me just unpack this a little. In the past, the way with which organisations thought about growth was, next year we want to grow 5%. In order to grow 5%, we need this much capital, this much FTE, this much blah, 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 input. And so growth was a direct function of inputs, fixed inputs that had a productivity factor banked into it. Well, the world doesn't work that way anymore. It's now characterized by exponential. And so the dilemma that I think a lot of traditional organizations have faced is that when they have sold transformation programs to their shareholders, it's typically ceremonially and symbolically presented at a annual general meeting or an event of some sort, where it generally involves the chief executive and management laying out a 5-year transformation plan, strategy 2025. And and what they're asking shareholders is to forego, dividends that is going to be reinvested into renovating this model to become this shiny new model that's going to live in perpetuity thereafter. So there's nothing terribly wrong with the word transformation. It's just been used and now is associated by definition incorrectly. And so when we look at the results, when we look at that and sort of say, well, of all of the transformation programs that have been produced or announced over the last 5 years, what proportion of those actually met expectations? And here I use data from a sample of 26,000 publicly traded organisations across 91 countries. And what we found was that only 1 in 4 of those that had announced transformation programs, in effect, had delivered on their expectations as were announced at the time of transformation. So that's fascinating, because then it invites the question of, well, what happened to the 3 in 4? And so and when you look into that in a little bit deeper, what you find is that we can't be thinking about this linear future as though it's a once-off event. And therein lies the problem, is that all of the evidence now concludes that organisational survival is no longer a function of a once-off event. And what we're now observing is that organisational survival is in fact a function of adaptation. Now, that's nothing new to us. This is Darwinian theory of survival, right? Those who adapt survive. So,
and not necessarily the fittest either. I think that was always a misconception.
Correct.
Yeah.
And fittest and being first, right? And so this, at that point, that's when I realised we've got to find a different word to explain enterprise or organisational survival in the future. And so after searching for 3 months, I found this beautiful Latin word called juvenescence. And juvenescence is defined as the constant state of youthfulness, the constant state of adaptation. And so what I talk about as an underlying leadership principle in both books, in both Youthquake as well as in Australia 2030, is that leadership, from now on, will be defined by leaders' capacity to adapt to a world or an environment that's changing rapidly around them. And if you look into what we've learnt in the last 6 months, it's been fascinating watching some organisations that have thrived and been able to make that transition and adaptation, others didn't. And you look at them and you go,
quickly,
similar business models, similar industries, what's the difference here? And so juvenescence is a wonderful way to think about organisational survival. Importantly, it's a great way to think about leadership. And the attributes, I think, of successful leaders and organisations over the coming years will be able to be mapped back to their capacity to adapt to a unstable, uncertain environment around them. So, COVID, as much as what we would love it to be the last, we don't know that. We don't know that.
Very unlikely.
But, disease is one thing. There's many other things that could also impact us of this size and scale. But again, when those things happen, how ready are our organisations, our systems and processes to adapt?
With startups, you call it pivoting. Larger organisations, I tend to view them The bigger they get, the more like cruise ships and
momentum.
So riding that ship, they can't just do a right angle turn.
I mean, I haven't seen a enterprise megacorp be light on their feet and nimble before. Maybe it's just a factor of the size rather than the leadership.
Yeah, well, okay, so I've looked at that question, but I've looked at it more from the perspective of saying humans' capacity to adapt should not be questioned, because the reasons why I'm sitting here and you're sitting there and we're having this wonderful conversation over technology is because we've adapted. Again, Darwinian theory, nothing new there, right? However, so we shouldn't be thinking that it is labour or people that is the constraint here. It's everything that gets in the way between the dog and the post.
Of course, that red tape, bureaucracy,
all of those
leadership,
systems, all of that kind of stuff. And so that comes down to what I believe will define the future of leadership as has now been imposed on us, which is what I refer to as systems leadership. And systems leadership is a level of collaboration between industries, government, and a whole variety, the research areas, all of these stakeholders like never before, because we've been forced to do that. And so, but what we've seen amazing results. We've been able to see, industries come together for business continuity. We've been able to, roll out what is a world-class healthcare response at scale. We've been able to do all of these things, and we've been able to prove to ourselves that we can do these things. But my God, it hurt along the way. And so you've got to ask yourself, let's just get rid of the pain. If we are going to live in a world characterized by increasing degrees of uncertainty, well, then now's the time for us to perhaps look at all of our systems and ask the questions of, are they getting in the way between the dog and the post? Because we've now accumulated a whole industrial revolution of legacy. And we're about to now go into the fourth industrial revolution. What's going to hold us back from that fourth industrial revolution? The legacy of the last industrial revolution. And so, now's the perfect time for us to be inviting new thinking, creative thinking, critical thinking, rather than looking for answers to the future based on yesterday's logic.
We have a strong tendency to do that, though, and look to the past and say, this is how it happened in the past. I've had this argument with people a lot of the time. They say, well, look, this is what happened when the Industrial Revolution happened. And this is different. Just that's the whole point of a revolution, is that that's right. It's not like the last one.
Yeah. If we go back and look at, the question of what does make a industrial revolution, there's many different explanations, but the one I bring people back to is the transformation around three key areas. Transformation around communication, logistics, and energy. And so if you go back to the first industrial revolution, power was our energy. Steam power, was our energy. Locomotion allowed us to move goods and services across national geographies. And the printing press was our way of disseminating information en masse. The second industrial revolution was defined by fossil fuels as our energy and telecommunications, which allowed us for the first time to communicate anywhere around the world. And then thirdly, mechanization allowed us to then be able to move goods and services in flight, move goods and services in mass transit. The third industrial revolution, of course, computing and everything as we've known it. What makes the fourth industrial revolution different is that it's not three distinct sets of transformations. It's in fact the fusion of a range of technologies that are all coming together at the same time. Let me give you some examples. It is the 5th generation mobile network. It is blockchain and distributed ledger technology. It is artificial intelligence. It is nanotechnology. It is space and material science. All of these things are coming together at the same time, which allow us to be able to treat information at quantum level to which we've never been able to do before. And I think that's one of the most exciting things about quantum computing, is that it will allow us to solve problems that we've never been able to solve before because of the compute processing required to solve those problems.
What are some of the outcomes you predict from quantum computing, like actually hitting its maturity?
Yeah, I think some of the more exciting areas are going to be around the combination of quantum computing and research methods from a scientific perspective will allow us to understand outcomes much, much sooner than perhaps traditional science techniques and methodologies would have before in the past. And so I think we're going to see some really interesting breakthroughs in areas like precision medicine, for example, the ability to customize a cure for a illness such as cancer directly to, in a one-to-one setting, I think is really exciting. And so you can't help but look at the sciences to help us understand the way with which healthcare can be significantly improved. The second area is space. Gosh, how exciting is that? We've got to go back. It was only sort of 50 years ago where the world was coming together around, one TV set to watch the moon landing. And now we're talking about having, humans on Mars within the next 10 years. It's just incredible. So those are the kinds of, exponential steps in human evolution, I think, that are really exciting when they're powered by quantum computing, a range of other things as well, artificial intelligence and the like. So, I think that's exciting. Now, why is it exciting? Well, it's exciting because it comes back to that same question: how do we increase our capacity to adapt to a world of accelerated change? And so the world of accelerated change is going to accelerate like never before. We will see more change, in the next 20 years than we've seen in the last 100 years. And so this is where the whole demographic area is really important. And I've been researching millennials now for some 16 years. And I've always been fascinated by the confluence of demographic change and digital technology. And the two are often sort of researched and thought about as though they're independent of one another. Well, they're not. And so, it's amazing to see now millennials representing, 1 in 2 in the workplace. By 2025, they'll be 2 in 3 in the workplace. And as you know, millennials have a completely different view about the future compared to other generations. And when I asked the question in the research about 2030 in terms of how do you feel about a millennial-led world, it was really pleasing to see more than 1 in 2 people agree that millennials are going to make better leaders of the world than generations prior to them. Now, that leads you into think, well, was the sample all millennials? Well, no, it wasn't. And so there were more Gen X and baby boomers that felt that sentiment more so than even what millennials. Really there was 8% of millennials who disagreed with that statement. They don't believe that they'll be better leaders than those
interesting
of the past.
Because I think millennials are older than people think.
We're millennials.
Yes, millennials are
go.
Right on the cusp. Yeah.
So the definition's a bit fluid, but I think as millennials,
it's fairly.
You grew up through the new millennium, right?
So we've got to put.
If you're between 22 and 38,
22 and 38.
You're right. You're right in there. Yeah. So the way we need to think about So age, why do we use age to categorize generations? It's because we have to put things into boxes. And then put a label on the box.
I hate to be like right on the edge.
We definitely do grow up differently. I've just had a daughter, and I was thinking to myself, she's gonna grow up thinking you turn the lights and TV off with your voice. You know, that's crazy. It's absolutely crazy.
Well, back in my day, we just clap our hands.
That's just normal,
funny.
you know. I turn the TV on. Sometimes when I want to watch something on YouTube, I just tell the TV to play it.
Yeah,
and I thought, wow, she's gonna think that's normal. Whereas when I installed all this stuff, I was like, yes, this is so cool.
Cutting edge, yeah.
And it won't be cutting edge to her. Yeah.
Before we continue this podcast, here's a message from our sponsor.
We believe that you can create art and beauty with technology. We think big. We move quietly. We are Ninja Software.
Jumping back to your point about your Gen Z kids, it's like when I was growing up, I hate saying that. When I was growing up, everything kept breaking. My PC kept breaking. I had to fix it. In the mobile first world today, things work pretty well.
Yeah.
And you never really develop the skills needed to fix broken tech. And I noticed that, you know, like the younger generation of today, I also hate saying that, get really stressed out when things don't work.
Yeah.
But to me, it's just normal. It's like, it's broken again.
And that's right. How easily we accepted things like that. I think what's fascinating about the younger generation, I've experienced it many times with my 14-year-old son, where I'll be trying to fix something and he would just say, just YouTube it. And he just hops on YouTube. There it is. In 2 minutes, there's the way to assemble that IKEA kit. Do you know what I mean? Everything's on YouTube. And so to them, instruction is visually, And I think, again, this is one of the intricacies that you're now seeing with the Gen Zs, is that they've grown up in a highly immersive, you know, visual way of instruction. And that is their default, particularly over their phones or over their computers, which have now become the two primary means, right? The two primary devices for consuming digital media, whether that's Netflix, Stan, whatever they're subscribing to. You know, the whole gathering around the lounge, for the family to consume media through one device, that's gone. That's long gone.
You don't think that Netflix has maybe brought that back a little bit? So we kind of gather around, and the gaming consoles, because I watch Netflix through my PlayStation.
Yeah. So what Netflix and that generation of media has changed is on demand. I can watch whatever I want, when I want, on what device I want.
I can't go back to broadcast TV.
Yeah, me too.
That's right. The electronic program guide. Why do I need to wait half an hour to? So and it's funny because this is where it's really fascinating to watch the competitive tension with broadcasters and reality shows, and you see the panic sort of setting in. I've heard people on the train, really concerned that they're not going to get home in time to watch Bachelor. It's really fascinating to see. We're coming back to, though, I think what we've always known, and that is that content is king. And content has always been king, even in the third industrial revolution. I think what's different now is we're now moving into a new motivational driver, which is all about speed to content. And our thresholds for tolerating that little thing spinning around on our screen is decreasing, in terms of our expectations are that we just press it and it's there. And that's what I think.
It's beautiful 4K and
and no ads and good subtitles.
Yeah.
High standards now.
But we obviously remember pausing YouTube videos so that
Yeah.
they would load up a bit and we wouldn't have to buffer.
Yeah, but we got NBN. Well, I see, some of us do.
Yeah.
So,
Well,
that's
we're about to have
absolutely right.
5G, and if Elon Musk gets his way, he's going to be, showering the world with a constellation of 26,000 satellites giving us broadband through Starlink. But this is important, right? Because our expectations have changed.
What are your predictions or fears with misinformation and the speed of misinformation traveling around the world? Social media, because you bring up 5G, which we're all looking forward to, but some people think it's going to give them coronavirus or let Bill Gates track them or some other such nonsense that is baffling to me.
it's the power of echo chambers.
Yeah, look, it really is. So I'll separate out the conspiracy theories around 5G and its relationship with all sorts of illnesses. That's not scientifically founded, grounded, or plausible in any way. I think the point here is that our trust has shifted significantly, and there's some really wonderful studies done by the Edelman Group, who've been studying the erosion of trust for the last 20 years. And we can now see that media has declined to its all-time low when it comes to the level of trust we put in media. So I think it all coalesces around that question of trust. And what my research showed was that, in fact, we believe that we will trust technology more so over the coming decade than what we do institutions. And so
And we trust documentarians more than we trust the Channel 7 news team.
Correct. And you saw this in the early stages of COVID, where governments around the world, people just weren't believing them. And so all of a sudden you saw a shift with the spokespeople all of a sudden being the chief medical officers, seeing our research academics step forward. They're the people that we listen to, because the politicization of climate change is a classic example of where I think the profound impact of that topic skewed our thoughts here in Australia on the importance of climate change and what was going on. The last decade saw the Australia achieve records with more prime ministers over a period of 8 years than any other country on earth. And with that brought the flip-flopping on climate change. What's interesting here that I talk about in my book is that the impact of the 2019-2020 fires was predicted by Professor Garnett in his report in 2007 to the government, and then by the CSIRO in 2009. And so in my book, I explore the question of why didn't we listen to our experts on climate? Why didn't we? And because it's interesting, there was a study published, worldwide study published a couple months ago that rated Australia number one in our response to COVID. And the principal explanation of that was because we listened to our experts. But we were ranked number 4 when it came to climate change. And so the question is,
It's actually
why?
better than I thought we would be, I must admit.
Yeah. Well, so why didn't we listen? And I think this comes back down to, in the last decade, we bestowed more trust, I think, in government and their policies and their position on climate change, and to the detriment perhaps of having a diversified access to other information sources. And so I'd say going into this next decade, what we've now landed on is government having the lowest levels of trust that they're on record. And so I don't believe, again, that trust is going to be restored back to what it was, 10, 20 years ago. I don't see that. And what my research is showing is that we're putting much more of our faith and trust in technology. And this is coming back down to diversification, right? And how do we manage risk? We diversify. That's a principle that's been applied for centuries. And we're doing the same now. Yeah, and we're doing the same now with information. We now look to people that we trust, friends, family. We go now to the community. We go out to the group. We trust consensus, self-rating. And we've been doing this for some time, right, on Airbnb and Uber and a whole range of things. So I don't think institutional trust, as it was in the past, will be restored. I think we're going to see a new model emerge, and that will be driven by technology.
That's interesting. So how do you see us getting past the problem of echo chambers? Do you think it's the responsibility of the social media companies to try and avoid that from happening? Because right now they're actually encouraging it. Their algorithms try to put you in an echo chamber because you'll engage more with the platform.
Yeah. So I would say we're coming out of a environment where the social media companies and the tech giants who began life understanding how to monetize data, and we refer to the FANGs, Facebook, Amazon, those they're Netflix, often referred to as tech Google, companies. Yeah, they're referred to as tech companies. I don't refer to them as tech companies. They're data companies. They began life understanding how to monetize data. And so, if you look at the intellectual property of those organizations, what is it? Well, they're algorithms. What's an algorithm? Yeah. It's a formula. What's in a formula? Data. So in the exponential growth associated with all of those platforms, which have thrived during COVID, we are now reaching that point where I think governments and regulators are now looking at questions such as, as media ownership, and we're seeing. So I would think we're going to see a rebalance happening. Now, the biggest rebalance, the biggest reset of all, I think, is going to be that the people that have lost the most to those that have gained the most is you and I and everybody else.
Yeah, it's something I've been thinking about a lot, especially in the shower. Funnily enough, one of the things we're working on is actually a project called RideFair, which is essentially a platform to create cooperative rideshare companies. Because the big barrier to entry for these guys, so they're getting together, they're trying to support each other, but the actual barrier to entry to the market for them is technology. So we're trying to solve that for them, so that they can start cooperative rideshare companies. But it got me thinking. I thought, Facebook. How could you make Facebook a cooperative where every single member of the community is a part owner? Because it's their data that's actually valuable, right? So just like your standard cooperative model, they would own as much data as they put in, kind of thing. I haven't solved it yet. That's what I see the future looking more like. Once the technology problem is solved, creating new interesting business models like that is not as difficult as people think.
Yeah, and I think it's important to just reflect on how important the open data reforms were here in Australia, and I'll bring specific attention to the principle of reciprocity, which was new in our reforms compared to the GDPR and other reforms in other jurisdictions around the world. And what that principle in effect establishes is a level playing field where the capacity of, perhaps the top end of town to squirrel away access to all of this data without giving anything back in return, does in fact level the playing field. And so, I think that in effect lowers the barriers significantly for value-added creators to come up with a whole range of new services, because access to that data is no longer a barrier to them.
Brilliant. We won't take up too much of your time. I must confess I haven't read your recent book yet, so I'm going to go do that. I do have it on my Kindle, but like I said, I just had a daughter, so finding time to read has suddenly become really difficult. I really enjoyed Youthquake, which I'll probably send you some thoughts if that's okay. I know I'll definitely have a ton of questions for you.
Yeah, because there's some great questions I know from what you guys are doing and the way you think, you will love chapters, I think 7, 8, 9. Now, don't ignore the first 6, but you'll love those chapters.
I'm just going to jump straight there.
Yeah.
I'll read all the way through it.
When you read those, you'll hopefully be filled with so much optimism that is being lost in a lot of the noise here. I think if you've got the opportunity to put the optimistic lens to your audience, it should be, because we have no reason to be pessimistic at all.
It's nice to hear that. Well, I just want to ask you, we always end on a whimsical question, and we've actually settled on one now. So I don't know how familiar you are with wrestling or boxing, MMA, but all the fighters have their intro song, right? So the lights go down, they walk into the room and their intro song plays. What would your intro song be?
Okay. My intro song would be a song by Crowded House, or is it Tim Finn? I can't remember. And the lyrics to the song begin with, "There's a pure idea in every mind waiting to be acted on." And that is just such a beautiful quote. So it's probably not the song you'd have when you're going into a boxing ring, but if there was ever a lyric from that song, and I'll get the name of the song and send it through to you, but that to me is it, because I think that sums up my view of the world.
I've actually
completely.
quickly Googled it as a millennial, and it's Tim Finn, "How Am I Gonna Sleep?" So
how am I going to sleep? Perfect, yeah. And so again, if you think about that, how wonderful is that? That realization that in each and every one of us, there's a pure idea just waiting to be acted on. Oh my goodness, how and empowering is that?
I gotta say, a song called "How Am I Gonna Sleep" is a perfect title for a futurologist. Exactly. So, thanks for Googling that. Gosh,
cool.
You're quick. I didn't even see you there on that.
It's just a reflex now. So,
yeah.
Oh, that's too funny. That's too
Thanks
funny.
again, Rocky.
Yeah,
no worries.
Thank you so much,
guys.
Rocky.
Take care.
That was
Have
an
a great
absolute
day.
pleasure. Yeah.
See ya.
You
See you
too.
then.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
And that's the end of this episode of Tech Society. Thanks for listening. On this day in tech history, 25th of September 1973, quite possibly the first personal computer was introduced to the world. Microcomputers of Canada introduces their MCM70 microcomputer at a programmers user conference in Toronto. Unfortunately, they failed to generate venture capital, and the product never gained significant market acceptance. The market was quickly overtaken by the Apple II and other early personal computers.
As always, this episode was sponsored by Ninja Software. We think big, and we move quietly. Check us out, njs.dev.